In this part, I want to describe how to modify an existing built-in title preset to suit your requirements, then save it as a custom preset. There are many animated presets that are quite complex, but I won't be attempting to modify any of these. That's the subject of a future tutorial. I'll pick out a fairly simple one and modify that. Modification of an animated title involves some keyframe manipulation. I briefly dealt with keyframing in part 2, but in this part I'll be going into more detail and talk about interpolation modes. I also want to make a brief introduction to cascading. This is a powerful animation feature that I'll be covering in more detail in a future tutorial. I'm going to modify a built-in preset so that I end up with the lower third where the text slides in from the right, then slides out on the left. First, I'll choose a fairly simple title preset that partly does what I want. From the list of presets in the titles collection, I'll select the slide left preset. Double-clicking on the preset loads it into the Automation Controller pane and into the Timeline pane. I'll change the text string and the font size. Now let's take a look at the title elements in the controller pane. The first element identifies the text block. It has a drop-down arrow which, when clicked, collapses all its elements. Below that are sections containing parameters that are animated, that is, keyframed. The first section indicates that the parameter in its drop-down list belongs to the Transform tab in the text block properties. Within the drop-down list is first the parameter name offset, and then the subparameter, which is the offset x parameter. You'll notice that it's the offset x parameter that's keyframed. This parameter entry has a double arrow next to its name. Clicking this causes the parameter to fill the controller and timeline panes. This makes the task of creating and manipulating keyframes easier. The second section has just one entry, opacity. Again, clicking the double arrow expands the section. To the right of the controller pane are three sets of icons. The floppy disk icon will allow you to save the preset as a custom one. I explained this in part 4. The crosses allow you to delete that element. If you delete an element within a section, the whole section will be deleted. Point to note, for some inexplicable reason, carrying out an undo action will undo the change, but also can result in the frame size changing, as it has done here. The duration may also change to 0. If this happens and you don't rectify it, the title won't show up on the Vegas Pro timeline. If you delete the top element, the preset, everything will be deleted. The third set of icons allows individual entries to be muted. Note that, in this case, if the transform entry is muted, everything below that in its own section will be muted. Elements that are muted stay in their initial state. For example, if I mute the opacity element, then play the timeline, the text is not visible. Now let's look at the timeline. The animation of the two parameters is depicted by two lines, each having a set of 4 keyframes. I explained how keyframing works in part 2. These keyframes control the values of the two parameters throughout the timeline. This particular preset doesn't do exactly what I want for my lower third, so I need to modify it. First, I need to rectify the vertical position. It needs to be selected, then pulled down into a lower third position. If the text block isn't visible, move the playhead to a position where it is visible. With it selected, the text block properties are displayed. I can now go into the transform properties and adjust the offset Y parameter until the text block is in the correct position. This won't affect the existing animation because the offset Y parameter hasn't had its keyframing enabled. As I mentioned in a previous tutorial, holding the control key down while dragging the slider gives more precise control. You can also get precise control by dragging with the right mouse button. I now need to adjust the offset X parameter so that the text block is just off the screen on the right when the playhead is at the start. You may have noticed that, as I adjusted the parameter, the first offset X keyframe moved as well. I'll now play the timeline to see how it looks. That looks okay up to now. I was going to delete the opacity parameter, but I think it adds a nice effect, so I'll leave it in. Now for the outro, which with this preset only exists as a fade out. At the end of the timeline, I want the text to be completely off the display on the left. The fourth keyframe for each of the parameters isn't needed here, so I'll delete them. I can do this by right-clicking on them and selecting Delete from the context menu. Now there's a slight problem here. We're left with the two offset X keyframes being unequal and maybe not in the center of the display. I'll correct that now. Another minor problem. The remaining last two keyframes occur too early. I want the text to exit with the same duration as when it entered, which is about 1.2 seconds. I'll drag the two keyframes along the timeline to correct this. Here's a little tip. When dragging a keyframe, you will inevitably change the parameter's value. If you hold the Alt key down while dragging, the parameter value doesn't change. To finalize the outro, the two parameters need changing at the end of the timeline. Now to play the timeline. If you find that the duration is too long, this can be corrected using the usual methods. I explained these methods back in part 2. Another neat thing about ProType Titler, adjusting the duration of the event doesn't affect the keyframe pattern. It does, though, affect the timings. I mentioned interpolation modes back in part 2, when I showed how to create simple titles and lower thirds. I didn't go into detail because I thought that it was too early in the series to do that. Interpolation modes define how a particular parameter value changes between two keyframes. The very basic mode is linear, where the rate of change is constant. To demonstrate the various modes, I've set up a series of animations. Each animation has its initial keyframe set to a specific interpolation mode, denoted by the text in the text block. You'll notice that I've omitted to use the manual and the split manual modes. I'll talk about these shortly. When I play the timeline, you'll see how the different modes affect the animation. I'll expand the timeline for each of the blocks. This will show how the animation progresses. The linear mode causes the block to travel across the screen at a steady state. With the slow mode, the block starts off slow, then speeds up to catch the others up at the end. The fast mode, unsurprisingly, starts off fast, then slows down to the end. Smooth starts off slow, builds up speed, and slows down to the end. The auto mode gives similar results to the smooth mode, but is more subtle. Now for the two remaining modes, manual and split manual. I've set up a simple animation sequence here. There are 4 keyframes in this sequence, 1 at the start of the timeline and 3 spaced out along the animation line. All have an interpolation mode of linear, as shown by the straight lines between the keyframes. I'm going to set the third keyframe to manual. It can be a little difficult to right-click on a keyframe, but here's a tip that may help. When you hover the mouse pointer over a keyframe, the keyframe dot will have a white surround. The keyframe can then be right-clicked and the context menu should appear. Now, with the keyframe mode set to manual, you should see what's called a Bezier handle appear attached to the right side of the keyframe. This remains visible as long as the mouse pointer is over the keyframe. When you move the mouse, the Bezier handle becomes invisible. It reappears when you move the mouse back. You'll also see that the handle has bent the animation line slightly. The manual interpolation mode provides a means by which the animation line exiting the keyframe can be adjusted manually to create a desired rate of change. At the end of the handle there's a node. This node can be grabbed and moved to alter the curve. Note that the range of movement is limited. I'll now set the mode to split manual. Split manual mode creates an extra Bezier handle on the opposite side to the one created in the manual mode. You may be asking, where is it? Well, it will only appear if, in this case, the second keyframe has its mode changed to split manual or manual. If I now hover over the third keyframe, you'll see a second handle. I can use this handle to alter the shape of the curve going into the keyframe. Notice that now the keyframes that are manual or split manual are identified by the circle around them. Finally, I want to point out that keyframes can be introduced at any part of the animation, simply by double-clicking on the line. You'll know when you're on the line as a small dot appears under the mouse pointer. If you create that keyframe between keyframes with manual or split manual modes, the mode of the new keyframe by default is manual. You'll notice that as I move one Bezier handle node, the other one moved in opposition. This is because the difference between manual and split manual is that with split manual, the handles move independently. With manual, the handles move in unison. Before leaving this section, I want to mention something that I haven't dealt with before. It's to do with the timeline. If you look at the timeline for each of the text blocks, you'll see what looks like a bar running the complete length. This represents the active timeline for the relevant text block, and by default is the length of the event. You can adjust this bar to create a different active timeline than the one on the Vegas Pro timeline. Here's a demonstration. Say I want the linear text block to be delayed for 2 seconds. Instead of modifying the keyframes to make this happen, I can simply drag the beginning of this bar to the 2-second mark. You know when you can drag because the end of the bar turns pale. Now, if I play the timeline, you'll see that the linear text block doesn't start moving until the 2-second mark. It still completes the animation, but because the timeline has been shortened, it does it quicker. I can do the same at the end of the timeline. This time it reaches the end even quicker. I'll expand the linear offset X entry. As you can see, the two keyframes occur at the ends of the active timeline. You can even move the active timeline by clicking on it and dragging. You have to collapse the parameter first though. Back in part 2, I explained how to create a simple 3-text block title. I had each text block fading in at different durations from the start. The feature I've just explained makes this task a lot easier. It's not necessary to create extra keyframes at the start. Just delay each text block at different intervals. Cascading in ProType Titler is the term used to describe the automatic animation of text block elements where they follow each other over the course of the animation. That's a bit of a vague description, so a brief demonstration is called for. I played the bounce preset, which utilizes cascading from the titles collection in part 4. This is going to be a simple demonstration. The detail will come in a future tutorial. I have a text block with a single line of text. First, I need to decide what I want the cascade to do. I can apply the cascade to either the characters or the words. For this demonstration, I'll choose the characters. I want the text block to start off the screen on the right, then cascade the characters onto the screen. The animation will be 5 seconds in duration. To prepare for the cascade, I need to move the text block into position at the start of the timeline. I now need to select the Navigate to Child icon twice to drill down to the first character in the string. Now, with the first character selected, I'll enable animation for the Offset X parameter. You remember that I do that by clicking the small faint circular swirl icon at the side of the parameter. I want the animation duration to be 5 seconds, so I'll move the playhead to the 5-second mark. Now I can move the character onto the display using the Offset X slider. Just one more step. I need to enable cascading by clicking the toggle cascade icon for the character entry in the automation pane. This icon is quite small and it's difficult to see whether it's enabled or not. When enabled, the front square is highlighted. And basically that's it. I'll play the timeline. That's a simple demonstration. There's a lot more to this feature, and I'll be covering it in more detail in a future tutorial. To summarize then, I've dealt with the modification of a simple built-in title preset, interpolation modes, what they are and how to use them. I've also introduced cascading and given a simple example. In future tutorials, I want to delve into cascading more deeply. I also want to show that ProType Titler has many built-in animated curve presets, how to use them, how to modify them, and how to save your modified presets as custom ones. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. In the meantime, bye for now.